The stranger arrived on the morning everything felt too heavy to carry. Rain pressed softly against the city, not falling so much as lingering in the air, blurring the edges of buildings and thoughts alike. I remember standing at the bus stop, collar pulled high, fingers numb around a paper cup of tea that had already gone cold. It was one of those days when even breathing felt like work, when the world seemed to move on without noticing how close you were to breaking. I had lost my job the week before. Not dramatically, not with shouting or slammed doors, but quietly, with a short meeting and practiced sympathy. "It's nothing personal," they said, which somehow made it worse. Since then, time had stretched into something shapeless. Nights were long, mornings came too soon, and hope felt like a word from a language I no longer spoke. That morning, I was heading to an interview I didn't believe in. The company was small, the position temporary, and the pay barely enough, but I needed something to anchor me. Anything. As the bus pulled up late, groaning like it shared my exhaustion, I stepped on and took an empty seat by the window. At the next stop, the stranger got on. He wasn't remarkable at first glance. Middle-aged, maybe older, wearing a worn gray coat and shoes that had seen better years. His hair was streaked with silver, his face lined in a way that suggested both laughter and hardship. He nodded to the driver, paid his fare, and stood gripping the rail as the bus lurched forward. When he eventually sat beside me, I noticed his hands. They were steady, calm, as if they belonged to someone who had learned patience the hard way. He smelled faintly of soap and rain. For several stops, we rode in silence. The bus filled and emptied, carrying pieces of people's lives in brief intersections. I stared out the window, watching the city smear past, feeling the familiar ache behind my eyes. I must have sighed without realizing, because the stranger turned to me. "Hard morning?" he asked gently. It wasn't the question itself that undid me, but the tone. There was no curiosity, no attempt to pry, just quiet recognition. I hesitated, then shrugged. "Something like that," I said. He nodded, as if that was answer enough. "Sometimes that's all it is," he replied. Something like that. We fell silent again, but the silence felt different now. Less empty. When he spoke again, it was almost casually. "You know," he said, "I once thought my life ended on a rainy morning like this." I turned to him despite myself. He was looking straight ahead, eyes soft with memory. "What happened?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "I lost everything I thought defined me. My job, my house, my plans. I sat on a bus just like this one, convinced I'd failed at being a person. That landed closer to home than I expected." I felt my throat tighten. "What did you do?" I asked. "I got off at the wrong stop," he said. I blinked. "The wrong stop?" He chuckled quietly. "Yes. I was so lost in my thoughts that I missed where I was supposed to go. I ended up walking for hours, angry at myself. And then something strange happened." "What?" I asked. "I helped someone," he said simply. The bus slowed at a red light. Rain traced thin lines down the glass. "Help them how?" I asked. They were struggling to carry groceries up a flight of stairs. I offered without thinking. We talked for a few minutes. Nothing important, really. But when I left, I realized something had shifted. My problems were still there, but they weren't the only thing in the world anymore. I sat with that. The idea felt almost too simple, but there was something solid about it, like a stone you could hold. Did it fix things? I asked. No, he said honestly. It didn't fix anything right away. But it reminded me I was still useful. Still human. The bus reached my stop sooner than I expected. My stomach clenched as I stood. The interview waited like a test I hadn't studied for. As I stepped into the aisle, the stranger spoke again. "May I give you something?" he asked. I hesitated. "I don't." "It's not money," he said, anticipating my discomfort. "Just a thought." I nodded slowly. "Okay." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "I write these when I need them," he said. "Sometimes I have extra." I took it, surprised by the simple weight of it. "Thank you," I said. He smiled, warm and unassuming. "Whatever happens today," he said, "remember that this moment is not the whole story." Then the doors opened, and the rain rushed in, cold and sharp. I stepped off the bus, and when I turned back, he was already looking away, just another passenger moving through his day. The interview was, predictably, awkward. The questions blurred together. I stumbled over answers, my confidence thin as paper. When it ended, the manager thanked me politely and said they'd be in touch. I knew what that usually meant. Outside, the rain had softened. I stood under an awning and unfolded the paper the stranger had given me. The handwriting was neat but slightly uneven, as if written in a moving vehicle. "You are allowed to begin again," it read. "As many times as it takes." I didn't realize I was crying until a tear landed on the page, smudging the ink. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. The days that followed were not suddenly brighter. Bills still waited. Rejections arrived in my inbox with mechanical regularity. But something subtle had changed. When despair crept in, it no longer felt absolute. I remembered the stranger's calm voice, his steady hands, the idea that usefulness could exist even in uncertainty. One afternoon, I noticed an elderly woman struggling with her bags outside my apartment building. Normally, I might have hurried past, lost in my own thoughts. Instead, I stopped. I carried her groceries up 3 flights of stairs. She told me about her grandson, about the way the building used to be quieter, about nothing and everything. When I left, my problems were still there, but they had shifted, just as the stranger said. Weeks passed. Then months. I found temporary work, then something more stable. Life didn't transform into a perfect story, but it became livable again. The note stayed in my wallet, creased and worn, a quiet companion. I never saw the stranger again. Not on that bus route, not in the city streets, not anywhere I could recognize. Sometimes I wondered if I would know him if I did. Maybe he was meant to remain anonymous, a brief crossing of paths. But his impact stayed. On another rainy morning, much later, I found myself on a bus again, seated by the window. Across from me sat a young man staring at his hands, shoulders slumped, carrying the same heaviness I once had. When he sighed, the sound was unmistakable. Without overthinking it, I leaned slightly toward him. "Hard morning?" I asked. He looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." I smiled softly, feeling the circle close in a way I hadn't expected. "Sometimes," I said, "that's not the end of the story." And in that moment, I understood what the stranger had truly saved. Not just a day, or a job, or a life, but the quiet belief that kindness, passed from one person to another, can keep us all from falling completely apart.